Hi Andrew,
Hi, Aditya.
welcome to Sudeep Audio's channel.
Thank you very much. Great. Be a real pleasure to be on here.
Thank you so much for taking out the time. I know you've been busy even in these so-called trying times, but it's great to know that there's good music coming out of UK and through your company Bohemian Junction.
Thank you. Thank you.
We just would want to know, how did you end up becoming a musician? I mean, your early days, your childhood days, so that viewers here can understand how it influenced you in your part of the world.
Yeah.
And what were your influences when you were growing up and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's that's a very good question, Aditya. Actually, my first introduction to anything regarding learning music was when I was around 9 years old. We always had music in the house, records being played by my father, my brother. But I happened to be at an old lady's house where I lived, and she had a piano, and I looked at it with this intrigue and excitement, and she offered me piano lessons. I was just had a little noodle on it, not playing anything, but it really intrigued me. And my mother promised that when I went to the big school, so when I was 11, I could have lessons. And actually, if you, I mean, you know this from India, most musicians start very young. As soon as they can physically sit in front of sit behind the tabla or hold an instrument. So for me, it was starting quite late. So, but I guess I moved on quite quickly, and I had some very inspiring teachers when I was at school. There was a young teacher, Mr. Ricketts, who was my piano teacher, and he just left university to go to teach for his first time in school, and I was in the first year of the school, and we got on very well. He was quite tough, but he was fair, and I think when learning music, you need that. But he was a real inspiration, and we had an amazing school music department. So I would be taking home different instruments every day. I'd knock on the door of my house and there'd be a double bass, and I'd be behind it, age 13. And mother would say, "Okay, bring it in," and then I'd exchange it for something else. So I'd go through all the different instruments. But the piano for me was like a magical invention that kind of took me to another world, and it got me hooked. And I remember having a piano lesson with another teacher in the summer holiday, and I found a book and it had a blues scale in it, and I played that scale, and then I heard blues and jazz that my brother and my father played, but I'd never played it myself. And so from the early age, I was not just learning classical music, your regular associated board or Royal School of Music piano pieces, but I was also improvising. So there was a composition sort of thread from an early age. And then at the first opportunity, I formed a band at school, and we would play a lot of gigs in the school and around the local pubs. Our drummer was 12, and you're not even allowed in pubs at that time. So his mother used to come along with him. Now he's a big music director, runs a studio, and he's an amazing drummer. But so we had a school growing up of full of music, and I guess that stayed with me, and I didn't think there was anything else that I wanted to do.
So, in Andrew, in India, you must be knowing, since you interact with a lot of Indian musicians. Yes, we do start early. We have children joining a tabla class at 5. They can barely speak full sentences, but they play amazing tabla. Starting at that
Yeah.
age. But in India, music is primarily taken as a hobby in most households. So, in your household, was it a problem when you, or was there any resistance from parents, or that why do you want to be a musician? Why not be a hobbyist? Why take it full time?
I think that I was encouraged to play at home, and my mother used to really ensure that I practiced. So if I was going to do something, I should do it properly. At that stage, of course, it was a hobby, but as I went through the school years and studied O level and then A level music, and then I took all my grades on the piano. I was studying clarinet as well. I realized that this was not a hobby. This was a way of life. So, and so I wanted to go to music school to study Western classical music. So I went to the London College of Music, which at that time the director was Dr. Lloyd Webber, Andrew Lloyd Webber's father. So he was a revered composer, his father. And so I was surrounded by 350 other classical musicians of my age. But it was a shock. It was a real shock because, where you're in your own school and you work your way to being, not necessarily being the best, but, high level within the school. Suddenly I'm in a music school where pupils were learning, they were virtuosos by the time they were 8 years old, and I was still playing football in the back garden, so but it was very encouraging because I was just surrounded by musicians. So I embraced that, and I guess I knew that I wasn't going to be a concert pianist, but I loved composing. So that from that early time became a strong focus for me. So I was also writing music. I still have a box of sheet music and the things that I've handwritten. And in fact, one piece that I wrote when I was 17 became the theme to the first feature film that I scored
Oh, really?
many
What
years
film was
later.
that?
A film called Little Box of Sweets.
Okay.
And it was actually, we recorded the score at Yash Raj in 2007, I think it was, one of the first recordings there.
Oh, wow.
So, but it was actually, and the piece appears in the film exactly as the piano music. So I'd sat with the director, and she wanted to have some music to play on set. So I wrote a few things, and then I was playing this piece. She said, "Well, this is amazing. This is great." So actually, I did some arrangements of it. They filmed it, played it on set, and that was kind of inspired people. But it was interesting that even though I wasn't writing for film at that point, the age 16, 17, it was going to be used later on. So that was quite a nice eventful happening.
Indeed. So after you passed out of the London School of Music, did you take up, did you join somebody as an assistant, or did you take up some kind of a job, or what was it like?
So it's interesting you say that, Ditya, because I know that in India there is a kind of a hierarchy, I suppose, or a way of getting into a higher position where you start low down, third assistant, second assistant, first assistant, etc. And to a degree that happens in the UK. But I was kind of determined to be a composer. I had my own studio set up at home, and at that point it was big racks of gear and desk and everything. Now everything's on a hard drive on your laptop, but there was something really exciting. I had a 1040 ST-FM Atari computer with Creator, which was the predecessor of Logic, and I was working with that. But I started doing just really writing music, trying to find that first job. So you kind of go through, quite a long time of, I wouldn't say poverty, but impoverished. So you do other little jobs, just side jobs to keep things going. But there was a determination that I had, and I would encourage musicians to have that. To when you have a vision of doing something, you follow that. And so I got that very first job of writing a 3-minute piece of music for a corporate video. And once I did that, I could play that to someone, and then I got another one. And then after a while, I had a reel with 6 pieces on to picture. So and then I got into short films. I started doing television. But I was very blessed to be working for one corporate company. They had their own recording studio. And probably every week we would record for British Airways or companies like that, Ford, car launches, and there would be orchestra. I'd have the full orchestra. So that was it was a rarity, but that was a very, very good training. But there was a point where the corporate work was not engaging enough. It was a little bit like, do the next one. So I think that's where film comes into it, where there's a story, there's a narrative, there's something, I think, much deeper.
Right. So, Andrew, again, going back a little, when you were growing up, did you attend concerts and shows in your college and school? And
Actually, I always call this my second music education, and that was that my brother played me music. He's older than me, and so he has a very eclectic taste, which I guess I took on board, having heard that music. And he would take me into his bedroom, sit me on his bed, and play me the Doors and the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, blues, psychedelic music, and then my father, I would hear South African music, folk music, and jazz, because he was from South Africa. So I would hear this different types of music, but so there was not one genre that I was interested in. I had a cross section alongside the classical that I was studying myself. And when we were at college, we had the opportunity of going to a lot of concerts and doing concerts ourselves in the college. But London at that point in the 80s was a hive of incredible venues. The Mackay Club, the Venue, so many different Scala, all these, the Astoria, really good venues, Dingwalls. They're all, some of them, well, very few of them are still there now, actually. But so we'd see a lot of punk bands, indie bands, things like that. But one of the after college, I went to some amazing concerts, and I think three that really stick in my mind were all three of them were at the Barbican Centre in London. One was Elmer Bernstein, the composer. He was conducting his own orchestral film work, and that was quite remarkable. And then the other one was Maurice Jarre, and he was also conducting the orchestra. And I met both of them afterwards and spoke to them. We queued up and waited backstage, and just to see film music being played by an orchestra and that melodic thread. And I think one of the things that they don't teach you in composition classes, or they didn't, maybe they do now, was that the most important thing is melody, to have a theme for a film. And I think maybe that has not been so prevalent in Indian films, but probably more so now. It's more thematic in a Western way, I suppose. But I found that really intriguing, and it was something that I wasn't really disciplined to do. And I think after seeing those concerts and hearing that music and seeing it played out and seeing what instruments played what, the French horn's playing with the flute in unison and this is playing with this, it was a really good way of learning. So, and then the other concert was actually Ravi Shankar's, I think, 75th anniversary concert. And George Harrison was sitting in the seat in front of me, which was very exciting. Wow. I didn't get to speak to either of them, but also I'd seen Ravi Ji play at a lot of the proms in the Royal Albert Hall, and so I guess they were quite inspiring concerts. So there was a lot you could see. I mean, there still is in London, obviously. I mean, not at the moment, but there's a plethora of cross genres that you can.
No, you're definitely very lucky to be in a city like that.
Yeah.
So, Andrew, how did this India connection happen? I mean, of all places, living in London, but how did the connection happen?
Yeah, the connection with India, I guess India was always on the horizon. Whether I knew it or not, I think it was just needed unlocking. I was listening to Indian music and music inspired by India for some years, and I was co-producing a record for a duo, Indian duo, who was signed to a major label in the UK. And we decided to record strings in Bombay. It was called Bombay at the time. And I got put in contact with Daman Sood. And I remember we came out to record at Western Outdoor.
Okay.
And this is I had released an album, worked on an album that had been released through Polygram a few years before that, but this was my first real recording.
And is it also?
No, I'd been before.
Okay.
That's a long connection. But I remember we arrived at Western Outdoor, and with Gary Hughes, the producer I was working with, and the lights were off and there were people sleeping in the live room. Okay. And I was thinking, okay, this is interesting. And we're about half an hour away from the session starting. Maybe it was a bit longer than that, but anyway, Damanji walked in when we got introduced to him, and suddenly the lights came on, people moved away, some mics were put up, and then the musicians arrived. And at that time, I think I'd handwritten all the music. So I had the full score, handwritten score. It was actually a cover version of Kashmir by Led Zeppelin. So I'd gone back to the original music, reorchestrated it slightly. And so we recorded, and that was an amazing experience. And I think that one of the things that myself and Gary thought, we wanted to do more with the musicians, not just this one project. There was such a, I guess there was we're very inspired, and there was something really beautiful about the playing, about the people themselves. And a lot of the string players are no more now. You know, there was I forget his first name, Chakrabarti, who played cello. A lot of them worked with Artie Berman in the early days, but then there was young people like Sandeep, who is now doing very well as a violinist. He was actually assisting Neville Franco, who conducted, and but Sandeep played violin in the string section. He must have been 16, I'm sure. He couldn't have been.
What year was this, Andrew? What year?
This was 97. That happened, and then we went back to London, back to UK, and we finished the record. But then we were thinking about how can we do something that incorporates the musicians and keep the process going. So that's when we formed Bombay Dub Orchestra, and then to now we've recorded 3 full albums, studio albums. And we came back, and we actually thought about it for 3 years, and then took about another 3 years to make the album. So, but I remember we did a session in 2005, March 2005, at Empire Studios, and Shantanu was the engineer, Abhishek was his assistant, and Daman was on board, and we worked with some amazing musicians. This was Empire when the full studio, the big studio, hadn't been cut down, and that was an enormous studio.
It was. And were these Indian instruments or?
Well, we recorded strings. I think we had 4 days of strings, and then we recorded sitar, bansuri, tabla, sarangi. And one thing I found quite amazing was that we'd be sitting there, and Damanji he'd put his hand up and stop the session. He'd walk into the live room and move the microphone by this much, and he just the expert of capturing wherever the best sound of the sarangi is, or the best sound of the sitar. This was something that was I thought was very special. So that was a continuation, and that's where the love affair began. You know, and then I was on and off living in Bombay around 2008, but I was coming backwards and forwards working on various projects. I think one of the earliest films I worked on was Wake Up Sid, did the string arrangement on that.
So you were contacted by the composers, or how did that kind of connection with films happen?
I think that people got to know that I was around.
Okay.
And at that point, I was probably the only guy doing that sort of thing. So, and it was weird actually, Aditya, because if I turned up just out of the blue, well, not out of the blue, it was just meant to be, I'd get a call. You know, oh, you're here? Yes, I'm here. You know, and I remember Vijay Dayal calling me and saying there was a session and we needed strings for something. So I got to know, because I've been around quite a long time, right, you know, meeting people.
So you were okay with Indian musicians playing the strings? You didn't think of, you know, getting it done in UK and then?
Well, the whole beauty of it was the Indian strings. That was the Bombay strings. They were able to do Western, but there was something about, certainly with the project that I was doing, I wanted to have those slurs, have that portamento, have that feeling of old Bollywood, you know, Umrao Jan or Ram Teri Gangameli, those sort of film scores. So that was what Bombay Dub Orchestra was about. But as you rightly said, there was a need to start looking at a bigger scenario, because there was only strings available, but there was only one double bass. Lovin was the only guy who was doing double bass, we'd have to bring someone in from Chennai or cellos in from Chennai. So there was a real, limit to what we could do. And I think it was in 2013, so only 7 years ago, I was working with Julius Pakiam on Doom 3. And we decided to record the full Western orchestra. And that's when I went out to Macedonia, and that kind of started that whole journey.
So Macedonia was introduced through Doom 3. Maybe.
Well, that was the first project that I was able to do out of India.
Okay.
So that was, actually, we did another recording. I can't remember the name of the film. Julius does so many these days, but we did one almost, I think it was almost 6 years to the day we recorded, and he came out to Macedonia. So that was amazing. Yeah.
So your company is called Bohemian Junction.
Bohemia Junction.
Bohemia. Because I thought Bohemian is a socially unconventional person, so...
Well, it is, and you're absolutely right. What I felt, Bohemia Junction for me was a meeting place for creatives.
Okay.
So, yeah, maybe unconventional, but in a slightly conventional world, but a meeting place for artists from India and from the UK and from the West. So a way of introducing Indian musicians for projects in the West and bring in, the orchestra and other services to India. And really what I was looking at, I wasn't trying to replace the orchestra, the string orchestra in India, because they have a certain style and a way, but when the composers were coming to me and saying, we want to have a John Williams or Hans Zimmer score, now you can't do that. That's not available. That's not, or not in the way with a 40 or 50 piece string section. So that was something that we could offer. So
what is it exactly that you offer to music composers and producers? If you could, let the viewers know.
Sure. So we exclusively represent the Macedonian Symphonic Orchestra through Fame's project, which is the company that runs that. They have an incredible studio. They've just, the last couple of years, built a new studio, purpose-built, beautiful place. And then we also represent Abbey Road Studios for India, so mostly for mastering, mixing. And again, mastering has really been done by a few people, and there's other people like Donal who does it externally. But it's not been something that has been readily available in India. So Abbey Road were looking to expand their services and came to me to say, could I introduce it and look after it for India? And it was, when you have a brand like that, which is probably one of the most famous brands in music, there's a quick yes is said. So, but with Abbey Road, we have about 10 mastering engineers that really can encompass all the genres and styles that India needs. So recently we mastered that Times of Music show. We mastered all the tracks for release, not for the show itself, but for release. So, and we worked with AR on 5.1 mixes, mastering the films. We've also worked with a lot of indie bands, so it's not just the big artists. But people like Santosh Narayan, and I think for one film we mastered 27 tracks. There was three languages, a Rajnikant film. So so a lot of Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Kannada, Assamese, Hindi, Urdu. It's not just Bombay, and that's the great thing, that it's right across the board, and not, as I said, not just the big names, but also indie artists we've been working with a lot. So that's on the mastering side.
Okay. How can one approach you? In the sense, if somebody's watching this video and wants to contact you and get your services.
Well, what happens, Aditya, is that even with Abbey Road, you can connect directly with them. But what we found is that particularly clients in India and the artists and composers, it's a one-to-one relationship. So say, for instance, let's just hypothetically say you've got an album to master. You'll talk to me, you'll play me or one of my team the album. I'll recommend a couple of engineers. Okay, it's a bit like Radiohead. Let's get the guy that mastered Radiohead, or let's get the guy that remastered the Beatles, or let's get the guy that's done all the Kylie Minogue stuff. So, there's some, and that carries weight as well. there's a good promotional value to that. Oh, we've had the same guy that's done such and such. So we would then take the WAV files, we would send them to the mastering engineer. We would and we'd push that through. We'd get a schedule set, and then we'd get them mastered, get them back to the artist, and we would make changes if need be. If there was any, and if the artist wanted to be connected directly with the mastering engineer, then we would facilitate that as well. Which I think is because it's personal. It's important to have that connection. So instead of just uploading them and waiting for them to come back, it's talking to someone, and I think that's important. And that's the very same thing that happens with the orchestra. And that process is a little bit more complicated. But say, for instance, you want to record a score for your film and you have X amount of music. There's a couple of ways. Some people will have the scores done ready. There's a few people in India that do write out the scores. So we'll get the scores completed and we just arrange the session. And I'll go through how that process works shortly. In most cases, we will get the composer talking to us, and they will play us a cue, and we will suggest the instrumentation. That maybe they've mocked it up in Logic or Cubase, so then we can say, okay, well, this is possible, this is possible, this is not possible, or maybe you have 40 strings, but you'll need to have 12 brass to compensate for the large size of strings, or for woodwind, we need X amount. So we would do that, and then we would go through the process of getting the composer or the studio to bounce the MIDI in place in the session. So we have the MIDI, and we have the audio reference of how the composer wants the strings or the brass to sound. Then we would give that to one of our orchestration team, who would then make the scores ready for the recording, and that would be done in Sibelius software. And that's a really important process to ensure that the sessions go well and smoothly, to make sure all the dynamics are there, the crescendos, the dynamics of louds and softs and that sort of thing, and any phrasing, because even with the Indian films, some of them want to have the Indian phrasing still, and the orchestra in Macedonia have become experts at sounding like an Indian orchestra. And it's interesting because they're Eastern Europe. Their favorite key signature is 7/8, and the folk music has some similarities with the sort of music that we take them. So they're very excited about working on Indian projects. But so once we've got the scores, we will then arrange the session time. And if you were the composer, you would connect via Skype to watch the session, and you would connect via Source Connect to listen to the session. So you can listen in real time, watch in real time, and one of our team or myself will be on the session as well. And then we will have the scores, the orchestrator will be on the session, so if there's any issues, they can talk about what needs to be done. And the director can be on board, anybody, that's the wonderful thing, that you don't have to go out there to do it. It's still a very interactive and immersive experience recording virtually. And I think everyone's used to doing things virtually now this year. But I mean, there is nothing like being there. And often composers do come out. Anurag Sakia, who did his big Borjit to the Assamese project, he came out. DSP, Julius, a couple of other South Indian composers have come out. So it's really about scheduling and that sort of thing, because often scores are kind of left to the last minute.
Do you also compose for the background, or the OST, in
Yeah.
case the film's music director asks you to, why don't you put in your own parts, or I've
Yeah.
given you a brief now.
Yeah.
This is my theme, or this is roughly what I want. I'm not giving you as a composer the exact notations that I want the orchestra to play. Can you add your own flavor? Can you
Absolutely. No, there's for me there's two sides. Primarily, I started off as a composer and then started the company to facilitate for other composers. I've probably written about 12 film scores. I think there's 4 on Netflix at the moment, and
You can give us names so that we can relate to.
There's Hamid, which was a national award-winning film, a music teacher, Bomberia. Um, Off the top of my head, I can't remember the other
No
ones,
problem.
um, but with quite often what happens is, yes, you'll get the music sent, and they'll say, well, we've just got the melody, can you orchestrate it, can you add such and such to it? So that, I guess, in a way, that's more producing or arranging. But we also do that. So we've probably got a team of about 10 orchestrators who are also composers,
Okay.
and we've got them all around the world. So we have them in London, in Greece, in Mexico, in the US, in Canada. So they can work around the clock. So the 24 hours are all,
Wow.
they're all, someone's available to work on it.
Right.
And when we worked on Flying Lotus with A.R. Rahman, his big orchestral work with his Seattle Symphony Orchestra, we had a lot of the team working on that. It was a very big work. And then when we did the big concert for AR for the Ambanis, we had 100 musicians on stage, and we reorchestrated all of AR's music for symphony orchestra. So so that was really, really interesting. So often there is a need to embellish and enhance, but I'm finding more and more that the composers are coming to us with amazing sounding scores, on par with Hollywood. I'm sure they'll be happy to hear that. But seriously, we and the orchestra are blown away by the quality. So, you know, for 7 years now, and I've seen this increase in over the last 10 years of the quality of music that has been we've been recording. So that's a testament, I guess, to the determination and the learning curve of Indian composers, and how they're seeing their own futures and how things are progressing.
That's true. Today's young composers are quite literate musically, and they are, like you just said, the quality is kind of really increasing when it comes to Western arrangements and writing.
Yeah, very much
Right?
so.
So we also like to experiment. I mean, musicians, when they're in the studio and you have musicians in front of you, you might want to change a little, because when you were kind of scoring or writing down the notes, you had something else in mind, and
Yeah.
suddenly you might want to change a little. So is that flexibility allowed when they're doing it through Skype? They might ask you to change a part. This is not sounding great. Can you please change it to something else or some? Does that happen?
That's a very interesting point. I think that with the orchestra, it's a bit different because everything is written.
Yeah.
So there's no real there's no improvisation. It's quite set in place. And what we would make sure is that we go back to the composer with the finished score, and that they're happy with what it is. Now, sometimes we may do something and go, that cello's not really working. Can we put that on the viola? Now, a Western orchestra usually aren't very keen on that, but the Macedonian orchestra, they're okay. They're happy with that. When I've recorded with the orchestra in Bombay, quite often we'd stop and rewrite something, and that's kind of part of the nature of improvisation and things. But I think when you're playing in unison, or when you're playing with a large amount of musicians, it's. But the other thing is, obviously, that takes time to stop, to rewrite, and you're losing. If you've got a 3-hour session, the clock's ticking. So it's important to have everything prepared as best as possible in advance, just for ease of playing, and also just the time constraints.
True. So, Andrew, you've been like exposed to the Indian side of making music, Indian musicians, their way of working. Like the first time when you entered the studio, you found some people sleeping in the live room or something. So, when it comes to work ethics and musicianship, what are the differences you found in working with Indian musicians versus those in Europe and different parts of the world?